Do you ever feel overwhelmed by your sin? Maybe burdened by it or guilty because of it? Is it weighing you down like extra baggage in your life? If so, today's lesson is for you because David is dealing with the guilt of his sin and what he did to others and what he did to his God. Join us today. All right, good morning. Welcome to our Psalm series. Glad you're joining us. We are on Psalm Lesson 51. Today we're going to be working through Psalm 38. So we're slowly working our way through this incredible book. So I'll start here. When Rob and I go to California, we pretty much pack enough to move there for an entire month, okay? And I'm not sure why, but every year we bring in luggage, extra things in this luggage, and it ends up being really, really heavy. And then I go put everything away, and then when it's time to pack to come home, I realize most of the things that I brought we never even used. And it was just extra baggage, extra weight that we didn't even need to be carrying. But what would have helped us is if someone would have just come along and say, hey, can I carry that luggage for you? That would have been nice, because it would have taken the burden off of us. And that's actually basically what our psalm is about today. Because for David, his luggage, his baggage wasn't clothes and shoes. His baggage was sin. And he needed it off of his shoulders because it was such a heavy weight. Today we're going to be working through Psalm 38. It's actually called a penitential psalm because it's a psalm of confession. We don't know what it's about. We don't know what sin David was feeling so burdened by. Maybe this was written because of his sin with Bathsheba. Maybe it was his sin of taking a census when he knew he wasn't supposed to. Maybe it was the sin of lying to the king of Gath. And we don't know what this psalm is exactly about, but it's one of 7 psalms of confession. Because David knew he needed God to take the baggage of his sin and basically haul it away for him. So let's start at Psalm 38, a psalm of David, a petition. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. And I think we all get this, okay? We know when we were kids, when we did something wrong, we wanted our parents to discipline us out of let's talk, I want to steer you in the right direction. We did not want our parents to act out of anger and discipline because they were so mad at us. That's not what we wanted. And this is what David's point is. God, please don't discipline me out of your anger. Now, some of you understand this psalm maybe too well because maybe you had a parent that when you did something wrong, they flew off the handle. Maybe they would spank you or smack you or whatever. And it was never out of love to help you. It was just they were just furious. They were just mad at you, okay? And so what would happen is they would discipline you out of their anger and their fury. I was laughing. I was thinking about this because I remembered the last time that I spanked our youngest of the 3 at the time. And he did something I don't remember what it was, but I was so mad at him, so mad. I grabbed his arm and then I just started spanking him. Well, the older 2 boys are watching this, and the youngest that I'm spanking is laughing. He thinks it's the funniest thing because he's probably too old to be spanked. But whatever he did, my reaction was just out of anger. It wasn't out of love or training or any of those things. So I get why David starts off hey, don't discipline me out of your anger. Because David knew, all right, what we know when we do something wrong, David knew whatever he did was wrong. And the reason why is because he felt the heavy hand of God on him. Verse 2 says this, for your arrows have pierced me, and your hand has come down upon me. And then David does something. He talks about how he's linking God's heavy hand on him with David being sick. Okay, look at this. Verse 3, because of your wrath, there is no health in my body. My bones have no soundness because of my sin. So I want to talk about this, but before you freak out, okay, I want you to know that if you have the flu, it doesn't mean you're sick. Even if you have chronic back pain, it doesn't mean you're sick. You've been sinning, sorry. If you had flu, it doesn't mean you were sinning to have the flu. Or if you had back pain or whatever it is you have, it doesn't mean that you're living in sin, okay? You need to know we live in a world where there is sickness, there are flus and pain and COVID and cancer and all of those kind of things. And for the majority of the time, that has nothing to do with sin. It has everything to do with Adam and Eve's sin. Okay, they passed that down and we live in a fallen world, and that's just kind of the way it is. Look at Job, for example. Job was completely righteous and he was very, very sick, and it had nothing to do with sin. We see the blind man that Jesus healed. His disciples are going, why is he blind? Like, is it because of his sin? And Jesus is like, nope, has nothing to do with his sin. We see Timothy, Paul and Timothy. Timothy, Paul's like, go have some wine for your stomach problems, okay? That's just part of living in this world. So that's more the norm. It's just, we're just sick because it's just what's in the world. But I was thinking about this because like Cheyenne called this morning, and she said, Brad had been sick and then she was throwing up all night, and then Susie was sick the day before. And I was thinking about that as I was working on this lesson. I thought, it's funny, that's just part of living in this world. She wasn't living in sin. That's not why their family was sick. So don't go down that path unless you really honestly know that it is a God thing in your life. Paul said something interesting. Because we do see in the Bible, there are a couple places where people did get sick and even died in some places because of sin. Look at 1 Corinthians 11:28. A man ought to examine himself before he eats the bread and drinks the cup. This is the early church, and they were having communion. He said, verse 29, for anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body of the Lord eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep. A number of people have actually died. And it seems like people were dishonoring communion and people were getting sick. And Paul seemed to link sickness and death with sin in this instance. But like I said, I don't think that's really the norm. I think it was put in the Bible to say, look, God takes this stuff really serious. And I think that the early church, he wanted people to understand how important communion was. But for David, whatever David had done sinfully seems to be making him sick. And maybe it's because of the weight of the guilt. Because sometimes when we sin and we're so guilty, it kind of gives us a stomach ache. Maybe we have ulcers, headaches. It gives us anxiety. It gives us fear. But here is what we need to ask. If we're living in sin and we know we're not doing what God calls us to do as his child, then does that look like us? Like, is that what's going on in our life? Because just like any good parent, they're going to need to do what needs to be done to bring you back, to straighten you out. And so if you're concerned that it might be unrepentant sin, then you just need to ask God. You know what I mean? Like if that's something that concerns you. But like I said, and I always want to reiterate this, for the most part, sin and sickness doesn't have anything to do with each other. But in the case of David, it sounds like it very well could have. James Boyce, in his commentary on Psalms, says this: you need to ask. Ask God, have I sinned or gotten off the track to what I know I should be doing? And is this setback God's way of getting me back on track and into fellowship with him? In other words, is God using the sickness to stop us and to bring us back to him? Is that what you think is going on? And if so, you just need to ask God. Or here's another one: is God using this to trim some of the rough edges of my personality and develop a more Christ-like character in me? Now, we don't like hard times, but maybe they produce character, okay? Maybe when you get sick, that maybe God is developing in you a sensitivity to others who you can now be compassionate to them when they're sick. I remember getting pneumonia one time, and I ended up being so sick I had to go to the hospital. But I remember feeling so awful, thinking, I am going to have the greatest compassion on anyone who ever has pneumonia because I now know how it feels. So sometimes I go, well, maybe my pneumonia was just a way to help me to be able to show compassion to other people. So it could be that, okay? Or how's this one? Or we need to ask, is God using my suffering to show that I love him for who he is, entirely apart from whatever physical benefits he may have given me? In other words, this is kind of the hardest thing. It's like, God, are you using my sickness to show me something about me and my faith? Like, do I follow you because I'm healthy? Like, would I keep following you if I found out I was sick, I had cancer, I was terminally ill? Like maybe it's a way to show us and to show God that I'm going to follow you no matter what. To really, really honestly say, to live as Christ, to die as gain. Like, have I gotten to that point in my faith? And sometimes, being sick really shows us that. Are we still going to follow Jesus, tell others about him, even when we are sick? I mean, that's another point. So I think that we just need to look and ask God what the problem was. But I think, like I said, for the most part, most of the sickness is just living in a fallen world. Look at verse 4. David says, my guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy for me to bear. For David, whatever his sin was, brought so much enormous guilt. And it was like a heavy, heavy burden, kind of like all the luggage behind me, okay? Tons and tons of baggage that are there. He says in verse 5, my wounds fester and are let me see if I can say that word, loathsome, all right, because of my sinful folly. I am bowed down and brought very low. All day long I go about mourning. My back is filled with searing pain. There is no health in my body. But for David, he seems to link this to his guilt of his sin. He says in verse 8, I am feeble and utterly crushed. I groan in anguish of my heart. All my longings lie open before you, O Lord. My sighing is not hidden from you. And I love what David says, God, you know all about this. You know my pain. You know my guilt. Nothing is hidden from you. And there's something so comforting about that we're not in this life alone, whether we're in the midst of sin or whether we're not. God sees everything, and his heart is to get us to a place of confession so that we can consistently have the lines of communication open with him, like we're not clogged by sin. Verse 10 says this, my heart pounds, my strength fails me, even the light has gone from my eyes. Whatever is going on in David's life, his unconfessed sin and guilt has a profound effect on him physically. But not only personally, but even David's friends don't even want to be around him. Look at verse 11. He says, my friends and companions avoid me because of my wounds. My neighbors stay far away. We saw an article the other day about a well-known pastor who got in a lot of trouble and basically just lost his entire church. It was a mega church. Lost his church. And I started thinking, I bet a lot of his friends weren't really his friends anymore. They probably avoided him just like David's friends were here. But this particular pastor apologized and repented and he was rebuilding his ministry and then we just found out last week that he got arrested for assaulting someone. And I'm like, really? And I thought, I bet those friends that actually stood by him the first time, I bet they're staying away from him a little bit more now. And that might be what David felt like. Because sometimes it's hard for us to be around someone who is sick or doing something that we know isn't right. We just kind of want to keep our distance. I don't know what to say to them. I don't really want to hug them because they're sick. I don't really know, and so we tend to pull back. And it seems like that's what's going on here in David's life. But I wonder too if it's because, with this particular pastor, people know him, okay? And then I was thinking about David being the king of Israel. People had so much respect for him. But then you hear about his affair with Bathsheba and what he did to Bathsheba's husband. And I bet that there is just so much disappointment. And I wonder if a lot of the people stayed away from David because of that, because they're just disappointed in him for what happened in his life. And so that could be what was going on too. Verse 12 says this: "Those who seek my life set their traps. Those who would harm me talk of my ruin. All day long they plot deception." He says in verse 13, "I am like a deaf man who cannot hear, like a mute who cannot open his mouth. I have become like a man who does not hear, whose mouth can offer no reply." David got to the point of even saying this: I give. I can't even respond or defend myself. And for us, sometimes that's the place we have to get to. Like, we know what we did. We know God forgives. But even think of David with all the people who knew he had the affair with Bathsheba, and they're gossiping about it and they're talking about it. Sometimes all we can do is trust God to repair the damage. Like, David knows he can't do this on his own. Look at verse 15. He says, "I wait for you, O Lord. You will answer, O Lord my God." David knows if he blows it in life that it will take time for people to get over it. And David says, "I will wait on you, God, to help that to happen." Verse 16, "For I said, do not let them gloat or exalt themselves over me when my foot slips, for I am about to fall, and my pain is ever with me." David reminds us what we're supposed to do. Confess it. In verse 18, he said, "I confess my iniquity. I am troubled by my sin." The first step to repentance is confession. Yes, God, I did this. Yes, God, I hurt you. Yes, God, I hurt others. I'm really, really troubled and sorry that I did that. I do not take lightly what I did. That is confession. But there is still a problem. Look at verse 19. "Many are those who are vigorous enemies. Those who hate me without reason are numerous. Those who repay my good with evil slander when I pursue what is good." David's like, I'm really trying to do what's right. I'm really trying to make it right. But there are people who just won't stop talking about it and won't stop slandering me. But David knows once again that the only one that matters is how God feels about him. That he has to trust God to take care of these people for him. Verse 21 says this: "O Lord, do not forsake me. Be not far from me, O my God. Come quickly to help me, O Lord, my Savior." And that is how this psalm ends. I'm sorry. I blew it. God, please do not leave me ever. I know I'm pathetic. And David knew that God would never leave him. And that is really, really comforting to all of us, because all of us have times in our life, seasons where we do go through a season, maybe like David, where we sin. But there is something of knowing that God isn't going to just throw us away, all right? He may discipline us, however he chooses to do that, but we're still his. So the takeaway is that, yeah, we can do some really dumb, sinful stuff, and we can feel sick over it, devastated over what we've done. But confession is always the first step. Because once we see how our sin affects and hurts God and others, then we can move on, knowing that God really has forgiven us. But through it all, we've learned a valuable lesson. And the valuable lesson that David teaches us is that we have a responsibility as a follower of Jesus to act different, to really be different, to handle people different, to love people different, to talk to people different. And hopefully we'll think twice before we sin so deeply that we ruin our reputation and hurt God in the process. Hope that helps you today. Have a really good day.